Thanks, Carl. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're going to start out with the videos first. We tried this earlier and we had some technical difficulties, shall we say. So we're going to do the videos first, and then we're going to go into chatting and sharing and passing around of some items. The first video you see is going to be regarding an exhibit that I did at the Detroit Historical Museum on the movies called The Real Story, R-E-E-L. The second video is going to be a short video on the 50th anniversary of the Fisher Theater. And then the third video, we're going to show you just about a 5-minute clip to refresh your memory on what Cinerama was like. It's from a new documentary on Cinerama.
Detroit, the real story. Detroit has always been at the forefront of film exhibition. From the early screenings of the first moving pictures at the former Detroit Opera House on Campus Martius, to the Casino Theater on Monroe Street, one of North America's earliest venues devoted to exclusively exhibiting films, Detroiters have long enjoyed great movies and great venues in which to view them.
Without exaggeration, there must have been 50, 60 neighborhood theaters in Detroit.
You pay one price, you can stay there all day, from 12 o'clock noon to 12 o'clock midnight.
But the theater was worth the price of admission alone, you know.
Theaters in downtown Detroit were initially concentrated along Monroe Street near Campus Martius, and after 1919 were clustered around Grand Circus Park. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Detroit's residents enjoyed viewing films at majestic downtown movie palaces, many of which were crafted by renowned architects. For those who lived far from downtown, the expansion of streetcar and later motor coach lines out Woodward, Gratiot, Michigan, and Grand River Avenues paved the way for the growth of many neighborhood and early suburban theaters.
As these cities around the country were spreading out, then these perimeter areas, some of them became prime spots for deluxe theaters. Witness at the Fisher, the RKO uptown, and the Cinderella on the east side.
The theaters were divided up. There were neighborhood theaters, downtown theaters, and drive-in theaters. The downtown theaters were sort of dress-up events in those days. It was a place to really go out, and one felt that he had to be dressed properly for the downtown theaters, and they only showed first runs. The neighborhood theaters would receive movies after they left downtown, and that's where we would go in groups. As a child, it was every Saturday. All the kids from the neighborhood would go en masse to the East Side Theater, later the Rialto.
Economic and demographic changes of the 1950s and 1960s dramatically altered film exhibition in Detroit, as well as the movie-going experience. Following World War II, residents began leaving the city for homes in emerging suburban cities. By the mid-1950s, Detroit's once viable streetcar and interurban train systems were no more, as individuals relied on personal transportation to transport them to work and to their leisure time activities. During the second half of the 20th century, the movie-going experience changed significantly, as theater owners utilized gimmicks and new technology to woo patrons away from their televisions.
The dish giveaway was probably the biggest gimmick that I can recall. I'm sure there were others, but that was a big one.
On dish night, everybody is holding their dish very, very tight. If one of the women would drop the dish, of course it would land on the floor with a big clash, everybody would clap. I wasn't married at that time, so if I happened to go on dish night, I didn't take a dish. Well, that was practically sacrilegious. If you were a lady, you took a dish, but I never did.
In Detroit, fewer people ventured downtown for a movie, and suburban cinemas sprang up throughout the region. Downtown movie palaces either closed or were forced into showing genre films, including kung fu, horror, and slasher films. By the efforts to preserve and restore Detroit's movie palaces were well underway, with the reopening of the Fox Theater and efforts to restore the Redford Theater. Many neighborhood cinemas were closed as patrons increasingly visited multiplexes operated by large theater chains. Detroit, the Real Story, showcases the rich history of Detroit's vast network of theaters, large and small, chains and independents, ethnic and specialty venues, and little-known cinemas from the early part of the 20th century through today's multiplexes. The exhibit also explores some of the extras, from popcorn to 3D glasses, that made the movie-going experience so memorable for millions of patrons.
You have that experience that's outside the home, and it's a communal experience, and the film takes on a very, very different quality. And I think there has to be a difference in our industry between what is film and what is television. And I think that certainly something will be lost if these things go away. And I think that we have a chance to go back to something again that people were really enjoying and make it new and fresh and better, and also you know, bring back some memories in some people and create a new experience for another generation of people.
The Detroit Historical Society presents Detroit, the Real Story. Enjoy the show.
Many of us experience childhood memories that on occasion rush into our consciousness. A memory that has invaded my mind on numerous occasions was when I was only 6 years old, and my parents took me and my sister on a special trip to St. Louis, Missouri. On the last day of this visit, we arrived at a very large, ornate old movie theater. It was as if we'd walked into a sultan's palace out of the Arabian Nights. It was the Ambassador Theater, and it was specially set up for a new kind of motion picture event. Here, we were to be treated to an unusual giant screen movie that would lift us out of our seats and take us on a trip all around the world. I am not alone with this memory, for there were millions of children all through the 1950s and early 60s whose parents took them to one of those special theaters to see and marvel at these amazing travel adventures. Through the years, I've always wondered whatever happened to this old film process, how it started, and how it finally faded away, and why it had such an impact on me and others. So I decided to find out, and this documentary represents what I found. It is told mostly through the words of the people who were there, the engineers who developed it, the crew members who traveled the world filming with it, the performers, and the exhibitors. People who are to this day still very passionate about its uniqueness. It's an American story, and it is their Cinerama adventure. The year was 1952, and America was experiencing the 40-hour work week, as well as buying new cars, moving to the suburbs, and contributing to the baby boom. Attendance at national parks doubled from 1948 to 1952, and then there was television, In 1949, there were 950,000 sets in the nation. But by 1952, the number had grown to 11 million, and attendance at America's movie theaters had suffered drastically. The average weekly attendance in 1948 was 90 million. By 1952, it had slipped to 56 million. Hollywood studio executives were stumped as to what it would take to get their audiences back into the cinema. Meanwhile, in a large indoor tennis court in Oyster Bay, Long Island, a small group of engineers worked feverishly to rework a declassified World War II motion picture training device. Upon completion, the heads of all the major studios marveled at the impact of this new process, but soon rejected it as too complicated and impractical. Undeterred, the inventor and his team of filmmakers rented a large Broadway theater to premiere their new process. Little known to the film world, this process was about to change the face of motion pictures forever. It was September 30th, 1952, and they called it Cinerama.
Hello, everybody. Lowell Thomas speaking, welcoming you on behalf of Cinerama Productions as well as myself. You are about to see the first public exhibition of an entirely new form of entertainment. We call it Cinerama. It's a novelty, but it's far more than that. It's the latest development in the magic of light and sound. The pictures you are now going to see have no plot. They have no stars. This is not a stage play, nor is it a feature picture, nor a travelogue, nor a symphonic concert, nor an opera. But it is a combination of all of them. In fact, it is the first public demonstration of an entirely new medium. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Cinderella.
How many of you remember that roller coaster scene in Cinerama? Yeah, wasn't that exciting the first time you saw that? Yeah, it was. And of course, we were the second city to have Cinerama. It debuted, of course, in New York, and what is now the Music Hall Theater was vacant at the time, and the new owner, Mr. Gaskin, was looking for a tenant for the theater, and he thought he had the Schuberts out of New York all set up for Broadway-style productions. But the deal fell apart. He was in New York speaking with them. He's on a plane back to Detroit. Several Cinerama people happened to be on the same flight, and they got to talking, and he said, you know, I've got this white elephant I don't know what to do with. And the Cinerama folks said, well, you know, we are going around the country trying to find other venues where we could project, you know, Cinerama films. So they looked at Music Hall, struck a deal, and Music Hall became the second theater ever, and one of the most successful ever, to screen Cinerama films. So, and you have to remember, these films were basically travelogues, but they were the highest grossing films of their time. And these pictures would play for like a year at a time. And in most of these Cinerama theaters too, you also did not have concession. So think of how much more money they could have made if they had concession. But with Cinerama, the most important thing was what was on that screen. So in the case of Music Hall, all the ornamentation in the auditorium had to be painted out brown. And you remember the big wraparound screen. Well, the boxes on the sides of the theater had to be sliced off to accommodate the screen. And then you also had to add an additional projection booth as well, because you had projection coming from 3 different areas of the theater. And this was really early surround sound as well. And Cinerama really paved the way for what widescreen movies as we know it today. These pictures were grossing a lot of money. The studios were getting very jealous. 20th Century Fox, as a result, came out with Cinemascope right after Cinerama came out. And then, of course, every studio had their own version of this type of thing. Paramount came out with VistaVision, and all these other studios came out with their own version of a different vision, which was basically widescreen. And of course, later on, it really paved the way for IMAX as well. So Cinerama was also very smart in terms of marketing, too. They captured your name and address so they could send you postcards of their upcoming attractions, much as we do today with email, letting people know what's coming up. Now, we talked a little bit about concession in the video, too. Now, concession was never a part of the mix of theaters until the 1940s. Now, the old Opera House on Campus Martius downtown served Werner's ginger ale, but that was it. The mindset for many, many years was that candy, soda, popcorn belonged at circuses and carnivals, and not in movie houses, and certainly not in stage theaters. So it wasn't until the 1940s when you started to see candy in theaters. Initially, machines in the backs of lobbies, ushers hawking candy up and down the aisles. Mid-1940s, popcorn was introduced. Now, people were sneaking in items because there was a confectionery store on the same block as most of these theaters. Or today we'd call it a party store. So people were sneaking in these items. So popcorn was introduced about 1945 or so. Then theater management got really smart and started to salt the popcorn. Well, you then developed a thirst quench. So by 1950, Coca-Cola was introduced to all of these theaters. So it took almost a decade for this to unravel itself. And of course today, as you well know, if you don't have concession, you can't survive in this business. And everybody always wants to know, why do we pay so much for, candy, Coke, popcorn, and why are they always trying to get us to buy the combo size? Because in a lot of cases, these Cokes are like this big, and you're going to spend more time in the restroom than you are in the theater watching the movie. And your jumbo popcorn is about that big. And this really has not changed today with concession. That is really the only way that you can make it in the movie business, because if you're going to get a first-run movie, say like most recently, Black Panther or Star Wars, obviously, and we're talking multiplexes now, you're going to put that movie in your biggest auditorium, and that is going to draw the crowds for quite some time, ideally 6 to 10 weeks. After that, of course, as the crowds die down, then you're going to put it in your smaller auditorium. And then by the end of maybe 12 weeks, you're going to put it in your screening room, your 50 to 100 seater. But for the first 4 to 6 weeks, 90% of what you take in at the box office has to go back to the studio. So you're only keeping 10%. Well, you've got to pay a staff, heat, air, lights, security. So concessions is really the only way you can make it, if you're operating a movie house. We are really lucky in the metropolitan Detroit market. We probably have more independent theater owners than any other place in the country. We've got Phoenix Theaters, which you've got right here in Livonia at Laurel Park. And of course, Corey also has the State Wayne Theater. He's done a great job of restoring that venue. And he also took over another field complex in Monroe. He recently just moved into the Dubuque, Iowa market as well, taking over a failed multiplex there and redoing it. We have Imagine Theaters based here. We have MJR Theaters based here as well. Many markets around the country, all they have are AMC or Regal, which are the two biggest exhibitors in the country. So we're pretty lucky. I brought, if you get a chance to, these are all historic popcorn cups, candy wrappers, gum wrappers. These have all been found under the balconies in many of the downtown theaters. A lot of people through the years also would keep scrapbooks because so many people used to go to the movies every week. They would keep ticket stubs cut out, ads, cut out stories of their favorite stars, because all these studios would have press junkets that came to town for almost every movie. And they would trot these stars to the various newspapers and radio stations, and there would be a lot of publicity on these pictures. Gimmicks through the years. These are 3D glasses from the Fox Theater in the early 1950s. Very different from today's 3D glasses that you get. Back then, you had your choice of color. You had about 8 different colors. And of course, then later on, we went to plastic. The Buona Devil was the first 3D movie, which played the Madison Theater. But most people probably remember House of Wax as the most famous of all the 3D pictures. 3D tried to make a comeback in the 90s and into the 2000s, but it's pretty much gone away. Gimmicks have always been a part of the industry, and of course today it's the fancy seating, the lazy boy style seating. Some of the newer theaters even have heat with these seats. Now, because movie-going overall attendance has gradually been declining, with the new seating, you're actually losing the total number of seats in these theaters. Like the State Wayne. State Wayne, when it was a single auditorium theater, had about 1,400 seats. Today there are 4 auditoriums with a grand total of 300 seats with the fancy seats. So, but of course your admission prices are up as well. So that makes up some of the difference. Michigan has always been on the forefront of the business as well. American Seating in Grand Rapids probably seated well over half of the movie houses throughout the country. All of these seats were made in Grand Rapids. Detroit was also the home of the Brinkert Light Projection Company, which made movie projectors for theaters all around the country. This was the top of the line projector, if you had this in your theater. This manufacturing facility was on East Grand Boulevard up until the late 1940s, and it was taken over by RCA Victor and then moved elsewhere. As in Cinerama, a lot of these reserved seat performance movies, you also got books. Like with Cinerama, you got hardcover books. Some of the other movies, you would get soft cover, like this one is for Grand Prix, Circus World, Russian Adventure, Cleopatra, Khartoum. For a number of years, starting in the late 50s into the 70s, some, especially the downtown theaters, had reserved seat performance shows, like Hawaii and Ben-Hur. You would purchase a ticket in advance, just like you would, say, if you were going to the Fisher Theater. You had a reserved seat. And the show would only be shown like 2 times a day, 2 o'clock and 8 o'clock. And these would play for a long, extended period of time. Sound of Music played the Madison Theater for 2 full years, wow, which by today's standards, it simply couldn't happen. We were also one of the few cities to have a building dedicated to the industry. I'll pass this around. The Film Exchange Building on Cass Avenue, directly west of the Fox Theater. And this building opened in 1926. Charles Howard Crane was the architect, the same architect who built about 50 theaters here in Detroit, 300 nationwide. This was the building where all of the studios had their branch offices. There was a screening room up on the 7th floor, which is where all of the folks who owned theaters throughout Michigan, parts of Ohio, and Indiana would come to see the movies in advance, and then all of the critics would be invited to this screening room also to review the films. So, and this lasted up until pretty much the late 60s, when that building became empty The studios moved their offices to the Fox Theater building, the Palms Theater building. The last studio to be downtown was MGM. They were in the David Whitney building up until about the mid-1970s. Early 1970s, most of these offices moved out of downtown and out to Southfield. Greenfield, 9 Mile area is where most of them ended up. And then by the end of the 70s into the early 80s, it pretty much became a New York and Los Angeles type of industry with no more branch offices. We also had National Screen Service, which was also on Cass Avenue, and this is where exhibitors, theater owners would get their press books, these were manuals to help you sell the movie with ads and stories. You would also get, to help you put your ads together, initially, for a number of years, your artwork was on zinc plates. So you would have to provide these to the newspaper, which is how they composed the page. By the 1970s, the zinc went away and everything became plastic. Plastic ad mats is how we would send things to the newspapers. I'll pass these around. And then you would hand type for the movie directory these sheets, which the show times and anything else, whether there was free parking and these types of things. And these went to the newspapers every week. You had people from the paper who would stop by the theater every day with tear sheets too of the ads that you had in the paper that day. And then you would keep all of that in like a little press book like this. This happens to be what the Fox Theater used for a number of years. Now, Detroit was also one of the few cities early on at the advent of films to have a weekly magazine called Weekly Film News. And this was put out by John Kunsky's Enterprises. Kunsky is the one who started out really big with theaters on Monroe Street, and then his empire evolved into Paramount Publix. And this came out every week, and I'll pass this around. There were stories not only about the stars and the films that were coming to town, but also the various theaters. And today we wonder why customer service has kind of gone out the window. Well, and I'll pass these around so you can see them. This is from the Broadway Capitol. This was a theater manager's manual, and this was a manual for ushers. Look how thick these are. Oh. Customer service was really, really important back then. Now, somebody had mentioned censorship earlier too, and I'll pass this ad around. This is an ad that, actually a story that was on the front page of the Free Press regarding a movie that was censored at the Gem Theater. And you have to remember, for a number of years, we did have regular censors. We also had the Catholic Church censors. If you remember in Cinema Paradiso, before a movie could be shown, and it's a movie. Well, your movie had to be screened before the board, before a movie could open in a theater. And if there was anything objectionable, then the scissors would come out, and they would cut out certain scenes that they deemed objectionable. These are little booklets I found too. The Greater Detroit Motion Picture Council, which was also another group that was involved in, shall we say, possible censorship of film. Now, if you got the handout too, 40s, 50s, 60s, the movie guide, you see that there were well over 100 different locations just within the city limits of different theaters. I mean, we're talking 100 or more locations, city limits plus metro area. And of course, today, within the city limits, you can count on one hand how many theaters are left. Everything, of course, went suburban. we have maybe 25 locations in terms of, Class A multiplexes, and of course hundreds and hundreds of screens, because you figure like the Forum in Sterling Heights is 30 screens. Of course, you've got your 20 screens at Livonia 20. There's 50 right there. So, and of course, with the model today, we're no longer seeing 20 and 30 and 10, it's mostly going to be 10, 12 at the most in terms of number of screens. Now, the Cinerama pictures also, a lot of that film was disintegrating. You saw the big warehouse in Los Angeles where all that film was just sitting there stagnant, disintegrating basically. No more color, that sort of thing. So two young gentlemen for the last 10 years have been restoring all of these films and putting them on DVD. Now, it was really difficult to capture, that huge curved screen, so they came up with this smile box format, which is very similar to that. And almost all of these are available on DVD. I'll pass around some of these so you can take a look at them. It's the wraparound screen format.
Interesting.
And these are available online. They're available. I know there's a couple of specials too if you order, like How the West Was Won, which was actually the last true Cinerama movie filmed in 1967, I believe. You can get a free copy of Cinerama Adventure, the documentary that we previewed. I know we have a lot of West Siders here tonight, so I'm going to pass around a few images. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, since we weren't able to see the Fisher video, this is what the auditorium originally looked like. It was Aztec Mayan, and this was all obliterated in 1960 when the Nederlander organization took over the theater to turn it into a legitimate stage theater. Fisher had been a movie house from 1928 all the way up to 1960. Interestingly, though, millions was spent on the Fisher, but for a good part of its life, it was always a second-run house showing double features, moved over from downtown, and also stage shows moved from the downtown theaters up to New Center. Some of you might remember the Westtown Theater, or the Beverly on Grand River at Oakman. The building is still there. It's a church today. Some of you might remember the RKO Uptown. This was a big 2,000-seat house at 6 Mile and Woodward. There we go. Of course, the Redford is still with us today at Lasser and Grand River. And several of you asked about the Riviera at Grand River and Joy. This is a stage show back when the Riviera was doing stage productions. Now, the Riviera, again, was over 2,000 seats, built for movies, did some stage shows. Then the Nederlander organization took over the theater in the 60s for not quite a decade to do large-scale Broadway shows. Then when they gave up the Riviera, they took over the old Great Lakes Theater farther up Grand River and renamed that the Vest Pocket Theater and did off-Broadway type shows like Pearly and Oh Calcutta, Hair, things like that. The Hollywood Theater was sort of an anomaly. The Hollywood Theater was at Fort and Ferdinand. This was over 3,000 seats. And unfortunately, this was demolished in the 1950s. The city fathers felt for years that the city was going to move and grow in a southwestward direction, which is one of the reasons why, Tiger Stadium is where it is on Michigan Avenue. Michigan Central train station was built that way. They felt that out Fort and out Verner, things were really going to grow. retail, theaters, streetcars. But unfortunately, we ended up going in a northwestward direction instead. And so that theater was hemorrhaging lots of money and closed in the 1950s and later demolished. Okay. All right, let's go downtown for a couple of minutes. Now, Monroe Street was the home of our first theater district on Monroe between Woodward and Randolph. And that's where the first symphonic sounds, the first operas, the first vaudeville, and the first movies were unspooled at the old Opera House. The only theater that survives that entire district of almost a dozen theaters is the National Theater. And you've probably seen this. It's beautiful terracotta, gold-towered roofs here. This was lit up with hundreds of incandescent light bulbs. The theater closed in the mid-1970s and basically has been sitting there. There's been a few grants through the years, initially for Super Bowl cleanup, and again several years ago, but nothing's ever become of it. The theater now, that whole block is owned by Dan Gilbert and Bedrock Development, and they are going to be breaking ground this fall on a 2-block mixed-use development. The exterior of the theater will be the gateway to this new development. So at least we get to save part of it. Does anybody remember the Family Theater on Cadillac Square? This was one of our oldest theaters also, dating back to the turn of the century. And this lasted up until 1973 when there was a fire. And the crazy thing is, they really stopped playing family movies in the 1960s. They were one of the first theaters to really go in for a heavy diet of exploitation films and art films. And I'm using that term very loosely. This theater was burning in 1973, and there were about 40 gentlemen in raincoats in the building at the time demanding a refund for the art film that they were watching. The Palm State, right next to the Fox, this was Dragnet was showing. And of course, this is one of our most beautiful theaters. The Palms actually is closing this week for several months of renovation. The big dome in the auditorium is going to be restored. The walls in the auditorium and all the beautiful murals from the proscenium all the way up to the top of the back balcony are going to be restored. And the theater will reopen in October. And this is the beautiful lobby with the beautiful Art Deco staircase at the Palm State, which is now the Fillmore Theater. And the thing that makes it even more amazing about the Palm State is it's been leased by Live Nation for the last decade. Live Nation is the largest presenter of live entertainment in this country. They also own Ticketmaster. They don't even own the theater, but they are paying for all of these renovations. A lot of folks remember the United Artist. United Artist was, in the industry, was always called the Jewel Box Theater because of its intimacy. And this was a first-run house for many, many years. Unfortunately, this one closed in the 70s. Probably the craziest transformation ever in terms of policy. This theater played first run for almost an entire life, big roadshow pictures that would play for months on end. But by the early 1970s, hemorrhaging cash big time. The last big picture to play there was Petula Clark in Goodbye, Mr. Chips. And it died big time financially. So the corporation decided we're going to close up for a week, get rid of all the nice furniture, and we're going to reopen as an art house. And this beautiful theater, I shouldn't even tell you, reopened with The Secret Sex Lives of Romeo and Juliet. You all know what theater this is. because you've seen it in countless videos and movies. This is the Michigan. This is where you came in the grand lobby. Today, you actually, if you're going to go to a football game, the Detroit Lions, and you want to tailgate, you're going to drive right into this lobby and right up the next 2 floors to park your car. So now you can still see the ceiling is still there, the columns are still there, but that what many people say that was Detroit's most beautiful theater, French Renaissance design. Anybody want to take a guess which theater this is? This was where you went to see art and independent films for many, many years. Studio? Oh, we're downtown still. This is the Gem. For a number of years, it was called the Cinema. Yeah, this was actually a premiere for Manon in 1950. Here's the Madison. The Madison was the flagship of United Detroit Theaters. United Detroit Theaters was, for many, many years, the powerhouse chain in town, owning most of the big downtown theaters and many of the large neighborhood houses. They had the Redford, the Ramona, the Bloomfield, the Royal Oak, the Ramona, about 25 theaters altogether. This was actually an advanced showing of Splendor in the Grass. This theater closed in the 1970s also. Of course, this is, of course, the crown jewel of the district, the fabulous Fox. Pass that around. And this is also the Fox.
Sound of Music at the Madison.
Yes.
Is the Madison the music opera house now?
No. The Madison was demolished. The auditorium was demolished in 2001. The office building is still there. The marquee is still there. And most recently, an Italian restaurant was on the main floor. So, now, this is an image of the music hall back when it was the Wilson Theater. The Wilson was one of a dozen or so theaters in the U.S. selected to host the premiere of Walt Disney's Fantasia in 1939. And again, this was a big screen presentation with surround sound. So the theater had to close for about a week so all of these specialized RCA speakers could be installed for the film. Fantasia. And here is one of the big fancy marquees that music hall had for Cinerama. Yeah, they're all going around. Okay, now for many years, all of these theaters, many of these theaters, I should say, especially downtown, of course, had an organist to accompany the picture. Because remember, when these theaters opened, many of them, the pictures were silent. And so you had a large Wurlitzer or a Barton to accompany. This is Arthur Gutta, who was the organist at the Michigan Theater. And then here's some sheet music I'll pass around too from some of these theaters as well. Now, the war years were really important too. Aside from Hudson's, who sold more war bonds than anybody else in town, movie theaters after Hudson's sold war bonds every single day. And also a number of show windows were devoted at the various stores downtown too, to the war effort. This is the Telenews Theater, which opened on Valentine's Day, 1942. And this theater showed nothing but newsreels. This was where you went to see loved ones on the big screen. You came in off of Woodward, teletype machines in the lobby spitting out the news of the day. If you didn't want to go upstairs or stay upstairs and watch the newsreels, then you could go to a lower level lounge. where there was the Detroit Free Press, the Detroit News, the Detroit Times. You could keep up on the news, and also WXYZ and WJLB broadcast live from the lower level. Now, the telenews was so popular that another telenews was opened at Woodward and the Boulevard. They took over the old Norwood Theater, which was just south of the Woolworth store. The building is actually still there. It most recently was a Payless shoe store. And of course, here's a marquee of the Fox during the war years also. And of course, this is the Royal Oak, one of our larger historic suburban theaters that's still with us today. This is actually leased by AEG out of Los Angeles. They are the second largest presenter of live entertainment after Live Nation. Royal Oak is a very busy theater, and it's probably one of the best marquees in the state. It just lights up 4th Street like crazy. It really brings that street alive. And of course, the Birmingham on Woodward. This was also a United Detroit house for a number of years. It's interesting because, again, the Nederlander connection comes in because in the 90s and into the early 2000s, the Nederlanders put in a lot of off-Broadway shows here. Then it went back to being a movie house. Uptown Entertainment completely gutted it and redid it and sort of gave it a Frank Lloyd Wright type flair. And now another firm out of California 2 years ago took it over and is bringing it up to date.
And where's that at? I'm sorry.
Downtown Birmingham, right on Woodward. Now, just north of downtown, we also had what we call a grindhouse district. Now, grindhouse means theaters that never closed, open 24/7, showing triple and quadruple features. The Roxy was a very cool Art Deco house on Woodward, just north of downtown. This area also had, just south of the Roxy, was the Colonial Theater, another large house. And then you also had the Mayfair, which some of you might know today as the Bonstel. And then there was also the Majestic. And then there was also the Fine Arts. Here's another image, it's out of order, that Hollywood theater I was telling you about on 4th Street. This is, now Detroit had a lot of premieres through the years too, and we had a lot of sneak previews of pictures before they opened nationwide. This is the premiere of War of the Worlds at the Palm State. Pass those around. Now also, in 1953, there was a new movie version of Julius Caesar that came out, starring Charlton Heston, who basically really wasn't known much then. The movie was a little risque, and none of the commercial theaters in town wanted to touch it. So 2 gentlemen from Wayne State University who were very interested in film decided to book this film into the auditorium, Detroit Film Theater at the Art Institute. Took out their own ads in the News, the Free Press, and the Times, promoted it, and it became very popular. Here's Charlton Heston in the 50s promoting that picture. And here are those 2 gentlemen here at the Michigan Theater, 1953, for the premiere of Shane at the Michigan. And they actually started as a result of this, because Shane had also been marketing manager for United Detroit Theaters. His job was to trot the stars around town to the radio stations and the newspapers and make sure that there was a lot of publicity for these pictures. And Bob Solomon did the same. Later on, they started their own firm, Solomon Sales Advertising, which exists today as Real Integrated Advertising in Bloomfield Hills, still doing lots of movie advertising. So anytime you see a movie ad locally on television, it's placed by them. Shan later moved to California opened up theaters out there and became very involved in the industry. And here he is with Rock Hudson on another press junket here in town. And finally, in case we have any East Siders here, the East Town, which was Harper and Van Dyke. This was another big 2,000-seater with a ballroom upstairs. Great vertical sign. This theater was intact into the mid-1990s. Beautiful inside. Everything worked. Seats were still there. Unfortunately, it was in a tough neighborhood, and parking was an issue also. There was also an apartment building attached to the theater, so the two were interconnected. But unfortunately, when you have tenants like a methadone clinic on the main floor, that creates issues. So they tried everything here, a church, a theater organization, but it just didn't work. And then finally in the 2000s, there was a fire. It was abandoned and totally stripped, and several years ago, completely demolished. So.
Do you have anything on the Senate Theater?
No, well, the concentration here is mostly on downtown.
Sorry.
Okay. The Cinderella was, of course, on East Jefferson at the bend, right as you're going towards Grosse Pointe. This was another United Detroit house, about 2,000 seats. And you saw a picture of this in the one video. Mr. Clark and his wife, who talked about dish night. Okay, those two met at the Chandler Theater on Harper, a little neighborhood house. She was working the candy counter. He was the theater manager. They met. They worked together. They fell in love. They got married. They loved the business so much, they started their own company called Clark Theater Service and ended up booking just about every major theater throughout the state, plus drive-ins. And their office was initially in that film exchange building that I told you about, later on the Fox Theater building. So we lost Bill several years ago, but Crystal is still with us. She can tell you what movie played what theater, how much it grossed, and all sorts of, and she still attends screenings. The Harper Theater, Harper near Chalmers, another big theater. This is still open as a nightclub. It recently was sold and has reopened. And they didn't have to do too much. It's called Harpo's today. So all they had to do is take the E and the R off and put an O and an S. And right down, farther down Harper was the Vogue, sort of an art moderne theater at Harper and Cashew. And this was unfortunately demolished to build a McDonald's. And then a couple of months ago, the McDonald's was demolished. And this is the interior of the Ramona, which was another big United Detroit house. This was at Gratiot and 6 Mile. All of these theaters also, for a number of years, had artists on the payroll too, especially the big downtown houses where they would create large pieces of artwork that would go up the sides and hang under the marquees as well. And, it's all about showmanship. There used to be big banners for, if the movie was in Technicolor or healthfully air conditioned, or this movie is in Cinemascope. So all this type of showmanship has pretty much gone away. There are standees that you, of course, come in contact with when you come into the lobbies now, the big cardboard cut-ups, but that's pretty much it. Well, you're welcome to look at some of the things up here, and thank you for coming tonight.